Okay, so what we wanted to do today before we jumped into the talk is talk about some research that came out a few years ago out of Canada. And so this research is going to kind of serve as a framework for this workshop. The research comes from Lindsay Gibson, who's a professor in the School of Education over at University of British Columbia, and then Roland Case, who's the president of an organization in Canada called the Critical Thinking Consortium. And what the sort of background to this research is that in Canada, they're undergoing a truth and reconciliation process in grappling with their history in the treatment of Indigenous peoples in Canada, right? And so there's big efforts and programs happening across the country, but the members of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have done a call, they issued a call to action to history educators that was critiqued by a lot of folks in Canada, historians and the like, who are saying, well, this is not what you're asking us to do, is asking us to change the way we do scholarship and et cetera, et cetera. So this is a response to those critiques. And the response is saying that we need to rethink the way that we teach Indigenous history. And not only do we need to rethink our incorporation of Indigenous history, but how we talk about, incorporate stories of Indigenous people. And we thought it worked really well for our context here in the US. We do not have, unfortunately, a truth and reconciliation process. Hopefully we do one day soon. But we thought that this was still some good thinking. So I'm going to go ahead and share this with you. It's going to set up an activity that Amparo is going to walk you through. So I'm going to go ahead and share the failings and the recommendations. So here's the first failing. In history classrooms, we in Canada, they're saying, and we in the US would say the same, we fail to introduce significant Indigenous events, developments, people. What you're going to see right now on the screen is the recommendation from this scholarship. So go ahead and take 30 seconds to read over the recommendations there.
I love that.
If you don't get a chance to read everything, that's okay, because we also have a Google Doc with all of this on there. I believe Amparo just dropped it in the chat. You can review that if you need. And continuing with this failure, this particular historic failure, the recommendation here is on the screen in front of you. The second historic failing is problematizing the failure to problematize ideology-laden terms. The kinds of language that we use when we talk about Indigenous history, right? There's a popular term that we talk about a lot, right? Like manifest destiny. We'll talk more about that later, how to problematize that. The third one is a failure to present nuanced portrayals of Indigenous people. Here is, whoops, excuse me, the explanation and recommendation. And special attention to that last bullet point. Okay. Our next historic failing, according to that research, is that we fail to embed multiple interpretations. And then our final one is failing to frame inclusive narratives. And that last bullet point we think has significant relevance to what we're doing here with this sort of regional contextualized narrative, looking at the Inland Empire. And this is the last one. failing to showcase Indigenous sources of historical evidence. And I think this is the one that was critiqued by some historians, and there's, you know, arguments about oral histories and oral traditions. And so this is the response to that. So I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Amparo, who's going to walk you through an activity related to these 6 historic failings and the recommendations.
Hello, everyone. I apologize, my voice is going. A little bit of a housekeeping note, if we could please sign in, that helps us document for the Library of Congress that we're running these workshops and that we have interest. So if you could please not forget to sign in and then change your classification so that when we go into conversation rooms later, Mark can help us with that. I'm going to invite you to please participate in a Padlet activity. And if we could go to the next slide. You're going to get a Padlet link. I'm about to put it in. I thought I had already. And we're going to have 3 questions for you. If you could please click on the plus sign. After the question, you will be able to type in your ideas and your thinking about this. We know that the failings are kind of like something that many of us haven't encountered before, had to think about. And so feel comfortable to go back to those, read them, and then respond. We also know that we're a large group and that many of us are not familiar with one another. We encourage you to know that these are anonymous and that you can feel comfortable to put your ideas, your thinking, what you're processing without, you know, being worried that we're going to know who put them on there. Those, what you put in the Padlet really help us to think about how to best support you and support other teachers in the future. So we really appreciate you being open and sharing and being brave about telling us your experiences. So we're going to give you a couple of minutes to look at the Padlet, and then I will also put in the 6 failings one more time if you need to refer to them. Daniel, can you go to Padlet so that we can see it?
Yeah, just give me a second to do that. I'm going to pull it up right now. You can see everybody's responses. Right, here we go. All right, can you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We see some responses being generated. We really appreciate you sharing.
Yeah, the time for planning one is resonating. Right, trying to find these resources is always challenging. Mhm.
Yeah, that trap of standards, right? Definitely. Ooh, the textbook, right? Yes. Wonderful.
Oh, I saw it right
Yeah,
here. Tribal
working with,
critical race theory. Mhm.
yes, okay. Using literature, poetry, right? Right. The idea that for many of us, this was not the history that we were taught. So definitely that's showing up in us being learners and walking in this process and in this journey where our students seems to be coming around. Okay. We want to give people an opportunity to continue to write in the Padlet. Daniel, we could go back.
Sure.
We also want to have a short conversation, open it up. And I think that I want to invite Don to share with us his process a little bit. And then maybe we can open it up to one or two comments. I think it's important that we see one another as people who are all learning in this process. And so I think it's important for us to hear from one another as well. Don?
Yeah, so in the interest of full disclosure and taking a step of being vulnerable, when we met, when we started our initial meetings around this, I was really excited to get involved. I consider myself fairly knowledgeable and culturally responsive. I lead trainings on that here for the county, so this seemed like it was right up in my wheelhouse, although it is not something, I went to UC Santa Barbara and usually I yell "Go Gauchos" after that, but I definitely had a failing in terms of my history education regarding ethnic studies in general, certainly Native American history. And so I'm sitting here and I come into this meeting with all of these fine people here. And in fact, I was really excited because I had a student intern from UC Riverside and I was like, oh, you should come in and listen to this meeting. It's going to be really cool. You'll get some cool information. We're going to be talking about some really awesome stuff, right? And so I think we're in the meeting for about 5 minutes. And then I just realized that my knowledge base is just almost non-existent. And I pump the brakes on everyone. And I'm like, whoa, I don't know anything. You need to talk to me like I'm a small child because you're saying words and phrases and terms that I don't know, that I've never heard before, that I've never seen. And I need resources, I need this and I need that. And it's literally been a whirlwind month for me, maybe a month and a half, in terms of just coming to an understanding about some of these failings, about where I fell into a lot of those failings, making broad generalizations about lots of different Indigenous groups here, and really a lack of understanding just about California history in general. That's not my fourth grade teacher's fault. I went to school in Pennsylvania in fourth grade, so I know all about the Monongahela River and the Schuylkill, and I can talk about that to a great extent. But it's been very difficult for me just coming to this understanding for the very first time, and recognizing that, like, really trying to grow. And so, like, I really feel for some of you guys that have put different things in here. And as I read that, I will drop like notes to the group in the chat, like, hey, if you got something or if you want something, let me know. Because like I said, in the last month, I've dived into so many resources just to try to be helpful and to be a part of this.
Thank you, Don. So if any of you feel like you want to share, right, how are these failings helping you to reimagine, to feel inspired? What is this making you think about, and what you need to do differently, what you need to hold on to in your classroom? If one or two of you would like to share, would like to open it up.
Can you repeat what you said? I'm sorry.
We said that if any of you, these 6 failings and some of the solutions proposed are something that you want to respond to, if these are inspiring you to reimagine, to rethink how you've been teaching indigeneity and Indigenous First Nations in your classroom, please feel free to share.
Hi, my name is Rosa, and actually, it's not necessarily that that I'm going to change my way of teaching in the fact that, of course, I have to continue covering the information that I need to cover, but I would like to embed more information as to Indigenous lives that we have definitely left behind and not exposed our students to.
Mhm.
But sometimes I don't know if I have the right resources, if I have the right information. And so speaking for myself, I'm here just to be able to learn and absorb as much as I possibly can from people who obviously have more information than I do. So just speaking for myself, this is kind of my first step forward in righting some of the wrongs that maybe I've done to my students.
Thank you so much, Rosa. Absolutely. I think many of us are very much aware that what we were taught has been outdated for a while, right? I mean, and that the historiography, that we're all catching up with the historiography. And I think it's really, really important that as teachers, we're aware of that, and that we also share that with students, right? That they know, hey, I found these materials to see how they work for us as well, right? Because it's important that they help us construct that knowledge as well. Thank you so much. I would like for us to be able to move on. We have a wonderful, I think I see one more person who was going to say something. Go ahead.
Yeah, come on.
Sorry, it took me an extra moment or so to catch my thoughts. I think something that's occurring to me is in getting into this work and tying my role as an educator with the past role I've had as a grassroots organizer, being hesitant, I think, to talk about some of the history and the experiences of Indigenous and Native people, because I'm not Indigenous or Native, and feeling like, is that my place to kind of tell those stories? to a point of paralyzing myself with it of, well, but wait, I'm the educator in the room. If I don't tell it, who will? And it took me a little longer than I am proud of to kind of move over that hump for the sake of enriching my students' learning.
Thank you so much for that. I think many of us are in that place, right? And I think that is a really important, again, a place to share with our students. I am bringing you materials that I'm learning about. I'm bringing you primary sources. I'm bringing you stories that I've uncovered. And I'm hoping that I do them justice. And I'm hoping that they help to complicate your understanding, but also enrich your understanding of the history of peoples who may be like you or may not be, but also of the complex history of the country. So that is really important, right? That we come to this place with humility, but also knowing that we are encouraging our students to be critical thinkers and to expand their understanding of where our nation has been and where it could potentially go. So I appreciate all those comments.
I'm not sure if I can still comment. Would that be okay?
Share
Okay.
one more, Sandra.
So, thank you. So I think that part of recognizing these failures is the idea of recognizing what they have done. And I speak for myself. I had the blessing to, a couple of years ago, go to a program in Washington, D.C. at the Native American Museum, the Smithsonian. And it wasn't, I'm a 40-year-old woman, but it wasn't until 3 years ago that I discovered that I was Indigenous. And I'm fully Mexican, born in Mexico, raised and went to school there, and was educated here. And throughout all that time, I had this idea and images of Indians that I realize now is what was taught in school. So part of this journey that I've been in the last 3 years, I heard somebody mention that they're in a journey of a month. I've been on a journey of self-discovery for the last 3 years, and I haven't even begun to scratch the surface. But when you do, because you realize again that in these failings, complete generations, right? The effect that hiding that you were Indigenous because of the prejudice or the risk and the stereotypes and the colorism and all these other things, right? That are so difficult to disentangle and are so complex that they don't allow, even if you are Indigenous yourself, to know and explain and teach because you yourself don't know. As a history teacher, as a reader, as a adult proud of your roots, there's still that damage that has been done by not addressing this. So it is a journey, and I thank you for bringing this to light and for training us and for giving us the tools to discuss this with our kids.
Thank you so much, Rosa. I'm sorry, Sandra. You and Rosa are right next to one another. Thank you so much, Sandra. I think that's a wonderful segue for us to continue learning, and I want to pass it on to, am I passing it on to Professor Lorimer?
Don's going to introduce her. Yes.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was trying to find my unmute button, and I have a fancy introduction that I wrote for Dr. Lorimer that I can't pull up right now. I don't know why that is, but that's okay. So I did find it, actually. So Dr. Michelle Lorimer is a historian at Cal State San Bernardino who focuses on the history of the United States, California, and Native America, as well as public history and teaching history. She's the author of Resurrecting the Past, the California Mission Myth, which is on my bookshelf, as well as several book chapters and articles that focus on the intersection of Native American history and public history. Her book traces the marginalization of Native Californians within mission history and critiques the romanticized narrative still presented today at many mission sites. Dr. Lorimer is actively engaged with local and statewide education initiatives, including the TPS grant.
Thanks, Don. So I guess I'll share my screen and then we can get started. That's not what I'm looking at. Okay. There's a lot of images and resources embedded in here, so it might just take a second to load. I really appreciated everything that you all shared. I had a lot of the same feelings that you all expressed, and I still do, even working in this field for, I mean, realistically for the last like 15 years, yet the more that I do this work, the more that I have reservations about doing it, because I am a white woman. I'm not Native. They're not my stories or my history to tell, which is one of the reasons why my focus primarily is on the ways that this history has been represented throughout time. So I'm not necessarily researching Native people and Native communities and trying to tell their histories as if they were my stories to tell. Instead, I really focus primarily on the ways that other people have told these histories throughout time and the failings of that narrative. So with this, I've established a set of goals for my talk, just so that we can follow through over the next 40 minutes or so with some purpose. So I'm not necessarily going to talk about the Indigenous history of the Inland Empire, in part because that's thousands of years worth of history, and I can't do that any justice in 40 minutes. But what I can do is expose you all to a variety of repositories, resources, videos, and general history about very specific points that we can use as entry points for various content areas across grade levels, so that we can find ways to incorporate Indigenous history through a variety of topics, themes, and experiences. So one of the things that we're going to look at over the next couple slides, they are quite dense, but we're going to look at some framework questions so that we can think about ways to maybe reframe some of the questions, or ways to take the questions that are looking at more broad US history or world history and place Native views or Native perspectives, Native voices within those framework questions, and then essentially within those standards. So looking at that, I have a few guiding questions, and that is, how did the history of Native people become so marginalized in dominant narratives? When we look at the history of California, Native people were the dominant population. They were the largest population in California until the years right after the gold rush, until the early 1850s. And so with that, there is much longer periods of history where Native people were the dominant group in California. And so how did that history become marginalized? We'll look at some of the ways that happened. And then we'll also look at ways to highlight Indigenous voices in social science content areas. If any of you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat as I go. I won't monitor them, but if somebody wants to open it up and look at it, that's fine. And then I'm going to share my presentation with all of you. So you'll have all the sources, all the links, everything will be ready for you to copy and paste if you want to use them. So just to get started, so I can see your level of comfortability, in the chat, just put in what your level of comfort is incorporating Indigenous content already. We've heard from a few of you vocally, but if you just want to put it in the chat on a scale of 1 to 5, what's your level of comfort locating and incorporating Indigenous content into your area? And then if there's a topic or two that you want to know more about, pop that in the chat also, so I can see if there are some things that maybe we'll cover, or maybe I can take a side little detour to talk about a little bit more. Okay, so a lot of you are pretty familiar. A lot of 3s, so right in the middle, 3s, 4s, 2s. All right, so we can start with at least a minimal base of knowledge and work from there. So I'm going to have a few slides now that have framework questions on them. I'm gonna look at the amount. I think we have a lot of high school teachers, so we can talk about things at that level. But I mean, the standards, the framework questions all build from each other. So if something fits in a third grade, we can make it obviously much more complex for high school levels of understanding as well. Let me see if I can see a few more. Boarding schools, current literature, narratives, California's genocide of Indigenous people. Okay, yeah, we can talk about those things. Okay, thank you guys for sharing. So, like I said, this is a lot of text, but it's important for us to look at the ways that we have tools like the framework or standards that we have to work with, and find ways that Indigenous history can fit into those. At the young grades, it's fairly easy because we're dealing with communities, things today versus long ago, looking at family structure, who are the first people who were settlers, why did people come to California, how did people move through California, and the different impacts that this movement had in the state. So there's a lot of opportunity, especially in these young grades, to really incorporate Native histories organically into the content in the ways that we're addressing things. One of the things that stands out to me commonly is the question of who are the first people in my community? And in some cases that is tied to settlers. Who were the first settlers in my community? What's the pioneering history or some of the early ranching history here? But really the first people in my community are the Indigenous people who first lived in these areas. So that's a great place to start if you're looking at the younger grades. As we move into 5th grade, you can see that there are ways to incorporate Native history as we look at the expansion of the United States and the growth of it as a nation, because Native people play central roles throughout the formation of the United States on the East Coast, but then also in California, Native people play active roles in the formation of the economy and of culture and of place also in the Inland Empire. So there are ways that we can incorporate Native people on local levels as well here. Just wanted to check the chat again to see if anybody had any questions. Okay. When we're looking at junior high or middle school grades, what we see is that there is a lot of space to connect students learning about ancient civilizations, changing environments, changing economies to local Indigenous societies across time. So if we're looking at 8th grade, students can explore the continuity and change of local Indigenous people with American expansion before the United States actually exists, and in the 1700s into the 1800s. So there's opportunities both to look at Native people before the arrival of newcomers in 6th and 7th grades as comparisons to what's happening in other areas of the world. And then in 8th grade, how are Native people contributing to the formation of the United States at that time? And then as Daniel mentioned, how can we complicate some of these questions? How did Manifest Destiny contribute to American expansionism? How can we change questions like that to really problematize the impacts of these kinds of words on Native communities and what Manifest Destiny actually means, especially the imagery of Manifest Destiny and the idea of frontier advancement and what that is imposing onto Native people, and realistically including Native people's responses to this because they're strong. When we're looking at high school, there are, again, many opportunities in 9th grade with these various framework questions to examine the ways that Native history connects with geography, California history, world religions, sociology, and ethnic studies, along with a whole variety of other content areas that you might cover in 9th grade. So when we look at things about, for example, in the Inland Empire, the construction of race and ethnicity in the United States, we can look at the ways that in some places, in many places, Native people wouldn't necessarily outwardly proclaim that they were Native. They would suppress that part of their identity in public in the early 1900s and late 1800s because it was dangerous in many places to be Native because of public policies and discrimination. People who owned businesses not wanting to hire Native people, for example. So there are ways that we can look at the construction of race and ethnicity, the ways that people alter identities to pass in society, but then how they still maintained their culture, religions, languages, everything over time, and still have some today. As we're looking at 10th grade, again, we can connect the history of Native people to the world. And 11th grade offers great opportunities, 11th and 12th in particular, to connect contemporary Native experiences within the content, because traditionally what we see is a lot of discussion of Native history in the earlier years, in the 1700s and early 1800s. But as we have the closing of the frontier and that whole narrative in the dominant texts, what we see is that Native people sort of fall out of it, and you don't have a larger discussion of the impacts and the activism of Native people into the 20th century. So it's important that in 11th grade, 12th grade, and then also comparisons into world history in 10th grade, that we can include Native people in the narrative so that we talk about different movements for equality and civil rights. But also within those grades, we can talk about boarding schools and the impacts that those had on Native children, but the ways that they also continue to practice culture, ceremonies, traditions, speak their language, even in the face of punishment. Does anybody have any questions? If something comes to mind, feel free to write it in the chat. We can address it in a little bit. So those are some places that we can see opportunities in the framework, and then related in the standards, where we can talk about Native people at different grade levels. But because we can see there's so many different areas where we can talk about Native people, that it's difficult to find an entry point sometimes. So through the work that I've done with lots of people over many years, it really comes down to two major things, beginning with the people and with the land. And that's one of the reasons why we began this workshop with the Whose Land Am I On exercise, because that's really the central piece. If we're looking at a history of the Inland Empire and Native people within that, then we need to really understand who Native people are in our area from Native people's own perspectives, and get a better sense of the understanding of the land. There's lots of ways that we can address this. Maps offer some opportunities, but they're not perfect, and realistically they're flawed in many ways. In California, there are currently 109 federally recognized tribes, but there are many more unrecognized groups beyond that. Maps like these that might seem familiar to many of you are maps that truly are representative of what scholars call culture areas. So they're regions where people have shared languages, understandings of their history and culture, but they aren't universal across the entire space. And there are many groups that fall within that territory. The boundaries are fluid sometimes, so you have a lot of mix between people of different areas. So here between, for example, the Serrano and Cahuilla, there's people mixing between those two territories. The same with many of the other regions. So sometimes these maps give a false impression that boundaries were tight and unpermeable, when in fact we see a lot of mixing and interaction. And realistically, the way that Native people organized their communities was on village levels. And within this kind of map, you would see it broken up into much more smaller pieces based on the ways that Native people would have identified themselves and continue to identify themselves. For example, if we're looking at the Cahuilla, there's Mountain Cahuilla, there's Pass Cahuilla, there's Desert Cahuilla, and all of those different groups have different they have different dialects that they speak of the Kuya language. And so that shows that while we have these maps that show a uniform group, that uniformity is not really the true way that people view themselves. And so what we want to do is represent people in the ways that they view themselves. So here I have this video, it's about 4 minutes long, where you can see an example of how we might provide resources that allow the people to present their own history, rather than as teachers or scholars, us try to provide some sort of description of a people's history. I may need to optimize my screen to show this to you, so just give me 1 second while I do that. I think it might prompt me. We'll see. Is it playing for you? Can you hear it?
Yeah, you turn it up a little.
Can't hear it?
My name is James Ramos. I'm the current tribal chairman of the people of Santos Manuel here on the San Manuel Indian Reservation. The history of our tribe really starts back in this valley. Probably the first inhabitants of this valley before cities and counties were established. And really the origin of where we come from, there was two brothers, Kruktat and his brother Pakukatat. Pakukatat was the older brother. Kruktat sprang from his left shoulder. And ultimately, it was Kruktat that created the Serrano people the way we are today. And there's stories that really identify with this valley and really around Baldwin Lake, Big Bear Lake, where Kruktat's body, his cremation, took place there. There's a hot springs, now it's called Pan Hot Springs. In Serrano, it's Maksuk. And those springs are still there today. And we take our youth, we have trips up to that area and we show where these things took place and where the eye of Kruktat came out during that cremation and became this white quartz rock that's now called God's Eye, but it's called Apuanet in Serrano. And it was during this cremation that was taking place when Kruktat was being burned, because cremation is how we conducted burials up until the incursion of the Spanish into this area. During that time, the people were circled around, and as they cried, because the one that created them passed away, their tears became the piñon nuts and the foods for our people. And the people themselves became these tall pine trees. And it was during there that our clan, the people of Santos Manuel, the Yohaviatam clan, began life from that Baldwin Lake area, because the people themselves turned into these tall pine trees. And Yohaviatam means people of the pines. Yohat is pine tree, Atam is the people. That's why our clan, we're Yohaviatam clan, people of the pines.
So in this narrative, you can hear the ways that this, at the time, he was the tribal chairman of San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, James Ramos. Now he's currently a California State Assembly member for the District 40, I believe, which includes Redlands, San Bernardino, I think Yucaipa as well, Highland. And so this is from an expert, somebody who knows the history, and he's sharing just a small piece of it so that we can better understand the areas. When you hear these kinds of narratives or stories, some of the things that stand out are the ways that people have a strong understanding and knowledge of their ancestral homeland. The places have names, and they can identify the places today. And so there's a very strong connection currently and over thousands of years to people's tribal homeland. If you have any questions or any additional comments,
I am
please
California of the past.
pop it in the chat. Try to get to the next slide. I also have an excerpt from Ernest Siva. He's a Cahuilla Serrano elder, explaining language and people. So I'm going to play this one for you too. It's also really short, but as you watch this, I just want you to think about the ways that you can include these narratives at different places within the content that you already teach.
My name is Ernest Siva. I'm here in Banning. We're next to the Morongo Indian Reservation. That's where I was born. Morongo is a word that is from the Serrano language, which means Madinga Yam, which are the speakers of the Morongo language. My family is mother's side are the Morongo people. We use the term Morongo today to mean the tribal affiliation, whereas usually the terms Serrano, Cahuilla, Lisang, and so forth are the tribal names. My father's people were the Cahuilla, Mountain Cahuilla, and that's where the name Siva comes from. Siva means spring. I grew up learning the Serrano language because my grandfather, my mother's father, spoke that language to them in the household. And I had two aunts who were very close, and so I heard the Serrano language most of my life. One of our stories is when I was, as I recall, one family would have lunches, sandwiches made of venison, and the rest of us would have peanut butter and jelly. You know, so some took advantage of that situation. And that was true in growing up about how we lived. My great grandfather, Francisco Morongo, was a Kika, which is the the keeper of the house. He was a coyote moiety. Francisco, being to me, the last Kika traditional of our people, realized that he was the last, and he told the people, "Yeah, I have my songs. I don't need to learn English or Spanish or any language." He spoke several dialects of other Indian languages, and he said, "I'll go home. I'm fine." He said, "But you who are growing up, who are going to have your families, are going to have to change. You have to decide, make a decision to follow as much as you can our way, but you know that we can't practice our religion anymore. We won't have the house, and we won't have the kika or the paha." And he was telling them that they had to change and follow the new way, what he was giving them a pep talk for. He said, "But when you follow this new way, you have to do it wholeheartedly. You can't just do it halfway." He said, "Otherwise you'll be drifters. You won't have full understanding. You won't be totally Americanized." He said, "You'll have shallow roots because you'll be lost." He said, "But if you follow it and learn, you'll be successful." He said, "But whatever you do, never forget your language." He said, that's the main thing. And never forget where you came from.
So in this example, you can see some of the really important ways that people today still can communicate the important changes that happened over the last century with their family histories. And this is just one of dozens of videos that Ernest Siva has recorded and are publicly available online. They're all really short. They're like these 2 to 4 minute videos. And they are great resources to use in classrooms with kids. And some of them he explains growing up, like in this one, talking about the different kinds of sandwiches that he used, that they would eat as a family, but also the transition between their ways of living and then Americanizing, and the kind of the push and pull of those, making those decisions. And so rather than just explaining that as, you know, Americanization and as a process and in these black and white terms, you can see by using these oral histories, by using the narratives that people are providing, we can make these experiences personal. And you can see the transition, and as families changed, the ways that they did it. So we have these resources and they're available for us, but some of the things that we have to contend with is how do we deal with the ways that they've been marginalized over time. And so one of the things that you can see based on the culture map that we had on a previous slide and this current map is just by looking at the land, the ways that Native people have been marginalized physically. When we look at the creation of reservations or rancherias in Northern California, part of the issue is that that Native people through the mid 1800s to the late 1800s were physically removed from their tribal homelands and pushed onto lands that white Americans moving into California didn't want, through processes of violence, land theft, and disease, through economic issues, and through just forced removal. Native people in many places were pushed onto land that was not as productive, and was out of the way of the growing American settlement in California. And so that partially is some of the reasons why we see Native people become marginalized, but there's also a lot more to it. So there's this physical marginalization where they're pushed out onto land that is really unusable, unwanted by many, but there's also a cultural suppression that happens through boarding schools that are throughout the United States in the 1800s. Does anybody have a question or something you want to add? I see the chat going.
Some good conversations about
Okay.
some of the points that you're raising, and the videos kind of resonate with folks in certain ways.
Okay, yeah, I'm reading Kiana's question about how does one begin to deconstruct the indoctrination for themselves and facilitate their students' understanding that Indigenous peoples' history is not just the history, but they still exist. So I think realistically, I think in some ways these videos are one way to do that, to show modern Native people who, like James Ramos, is living in a way that looks familiar to many people, but also has very deep cultural understanding and connection to his people, and in that it's a good example to show the ways that Native people today, kind of as Ernest Siva was talking about, live in multiple worlds. In looking at the land dispossession aspect of it, one of the things that we can use as a primary source is this Treaty of Temecula that I've included a few of the articles for you here so that you can see the ways that the United States government, along with settlers and squatters and people looking to take native land, worked to remove the rich aspects of Native people's culture and history, suppress it, but also because they didn't respect it or understand it or seek to understand it, turned it into something that is much more policy driven. In 1851 and 1852, the United States government sent out a few people to make treaties with different groups. And I think somebody needs to mute their microphone. So they sent out a few people to make treaties with various groups in California, which eventually led to 18 treaties. The Treaty of Temecula was one of those treaties. It was Treaty K. And the Treaty of Temecula included a large piece of land that's much beyond Temecula. I have an image of it here. You can see Treaty K is this top piece here. This map is a generalization of the lands that people ceded through this treaty process. And then the dark areas are the lands that people were able to keep. So you can see that the Treaty of Temecula, the lands that were ceded were generally the most prosperous lands, the lands along the coast, the inland valley areas where there's good ranching and farming activities, and people themselves are relegated more to regions that were less productive for the land. But what also happened with this, when we look at the treaties, is that these treaties ceded native land to the federal government, but they also established these reservations. Through these treaties, Native people would have ceded millions of acres to the government to have these protected lands, but there was a few issues with the treaties. First of all, the commissioners who were negotiating the treaties didn't understand Native people's cultures, political organizations, or structures. And so they would take the head of a particular village and accept that person as holding the voice for all people in a particular region. So many people didn't agree to these treaties, but realistically, in the end, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify these treaties because people in California, American people, white people in California, pushed very hard against this because they argued that this land set aside too much good land for Native people in California. So that's why when we look at the previous map, we can see that the land that actually gets reserved for Native people over a much longer period of time is much, much, much smaller. So when we look at the Treaty of Temecula as a primary source, there are a few different ways that you can use these in classrooms. I'd be really curious to know if anybody is using this in any part of your lesson planning. But what we see here are several different points where the United States is establishing a relationship with Native people in Southern California, and then also stipulating what the United States government will furnish in response. So they will create a reservation where Native people will essentially subsist on the federal government, furnishing them cattle, clothing, and the different things that you need to use to work, farming equipment. So within this treaty, it provides you with many opportunities to talk about the kinds of ways of life that the US government was pushing on Native people in this area. We don't see Native people's voices within these treaties, or Native people representing the ways that they would want their life to be on the reservations. And so there's a lot of opportunities here to discuss that with students. And when we look at those treaties, we can see the ways that Native people are being dispossessed from the land in this broader US view of Native people. And then when we look at what eventually establishes the reservations in Southern California, these executive orders, what we see is an even further dehumanizing of the land by just really talking about it in the idea or in the ways that, say, a plat map would. We're looking at townships, ranges, and sections, reserving small pieces of land for particular groups. And that comes out of the reports of different Indian Affairs commissioners who talk about really the horrible conditions that Native people are living in because they are being attacked and facing a lot of issues, a lot of violence with the squatters and land thefts that are coming in to Southern California and throughout the nation. When we look at sorry, is there an issue with my audio?
Yeah, Michelle, I think when you toggled with your audio settings, something happened. It's a slight feedback though. It's not anything that's interrupting what you're trying to say. But if you're hearing that feedback, it's coming from your computer.
Okay. I don't hear anything, but I just saw your messages. So maybe it's my phone being next to my thing. Okay. I can change my speaker if it's messed up too. So when we're looking at the different ways that people are describing the land, there are those two first ways we can look at. We can look at some of the treaties. We can look at the executive orders that establish reservations. We can also look at some of the writings of commissioners who talk about the ways that Native people were living and the different kinds of provisions that they were trying to make here. So here we have Charles Painter. He's an agent of Indian rights in 1888. And he's talking about some previous work done by Helen Hunt Jackson, who was the author of Ramona and who really instigated a large amount of American tourists coming into Southern California through her book, talking about the ways that people are taking advantage of Native people's lands in Southern California, and then urging the use of the Severalty Bill and its provisions, which is essentially land allotment in Southern California. We also see that through these, they talk about the rights to water and other resources on the land that Native people hold. And so what many of the dominant narratives end up focusing on, especially if you're going to be using written documents to write histories, are these kinds of narratives, looking at the writings of the commissioners who traveled throughout California to write the treaties, the writings of these kinds of Indian Affairs commissioners who are looking to discuss the different treaty rights of Native people and their land. So Native voices are really lacking in many of these kinds of narratives. So what we see then through that is a history over the late 1800s and early 1900s where Native peoples, tribal homelands and cultures are not respected through policies both on local levels and on national levels, where squatters habitually are slowly eating away at Native people's lands, but also through violence and destruction, tearing apart many of their communities. But Native people at the same time are fighting back. There's a lot of resistance and a lot of resilience in Native communities to maintain their lifeways and to work with some of these commissioners like Helen Hunt Jackson to have lawyers come in and protect their land. So it's not just a story about Native people being victimized, but also of them actively working in the ways that they can to protect themselves. Native people couldn't speak up in court at the time, so they had to have a white person essentially there who could testify in court on their behalf. So through these, we see executive orders that establish these various reservations in our area. So I just included a couple, like San Manuel in 1891, Pachanga in 1882, Morongo 1876, and Agua Caliente. But that's not really the end of the story, and those reservations don't encompass nearly much of the tribal homelands of these people. There's other examples that we can look at that show the ways that boarding schools are also quite destructive of Native peoples and their cultures. So we were going to do a breakout session, but we're running behind. So I just want you to think about in the back of your minds the ways that you might connect this content into your classes, what kind of impact that these policies might have had on Native people, which ways these policies misrepresented central aspects of Native history and culture, especially when we look at the ways that they discuss the land versus the ways that James Ramos discussed the land and the ways that Ernest Siva discusses his cultural understanding of his area and of his people. And as a part of that, I want to reflect back also then to the 6 failings, thinking about ways that we might humanize text-based discussions of land, culture, and identity. Okay, so then I'm trying to check the time because I know we're running tight. Okay, so when we're looking at the Inland Empire, there's a very prominent case study that we can think about, and that is Sherman Institute. In Riverside, we have a federal Indian boarding school that was established in the late 1800s, and it still is in existence today, but with very different purposes. So it's a great place to examine when you're talking about change over time, when you're looking at historical significance of these different kinds of policies and the ways that policies can go from one of displacement and cultural suppression to one of cultural resilience and affirmation. Sherman itself was established in the 1890s as Paris Indian School in Paris, California, but because of a lack of access to good water over time, and then following overcrowding issues, the school was moved into Riverside. And here you can see a few images of Sherman with its mission, revival, architecture, which is intentional. It's a part of the tourism draw that brought people to Riverside. And what we see as a result is that kids who came into Sherman were participating in a very rigid, and as you can see in this bottom image on the right, a type of atmosphere where students ran drill lines, but also where they had lots of visitors from the outside coming to watch them. In the early years, Sherman was a place of assimilation where students were forcibly brought from their homes, pulled off of reservations and into school, where they would live and work for years if they couldn't afford to return home. Sherman had a farm where students worked. They had also many vocational programs and also several different kinds of I guess recreational programs or extracurricular activities like band, sports, and through those, students were essentially acculturated into various aspects of American Victorian vocational trainings. And again, all of this is a part of this infrastructure of tourism and industry that developed in Southern California in the early 1900s. So when we look at the change to the land and the displacement of Native people from it, what we see is Native people being pushed out, removed to more remote places of the land, and then in more populated Americanized areas, we have these views of Native people that are mitigated through the lens of these boarding schools where Native students are being Americanized, where they are working in the city, within Riverside, in community centers, in the homes of people in Riverside. And they are showing that they, in many ways, have put away their old ways of life, not on purpose, but because they have been forced to outwardly suppress that. But students continue to practice their language and culture and traditions quietly. Here you can see some more of these images, but then you can also see the ways that the school would use students when aspects of their culture could help sell tourists to coming to Sherman. And then into the 1940s and 50s, you have these eagle dancers, Hopi eagle dancers showing their dance at the school, and then also here at a Corona citrus fair, because the citrus industry in Riverside is connected more broadly to the tourism that we see in the area. And so when Native people are put back into the narrative, it's through the lens of tourism here, where people are coming to see them change, but also to see their aspects of culture that are removed from more modern society. But of course, this is a much more nuanced presence. So one of the things that I would really welcome you all to explore, and I really highly encourage you to look at, is this brand new virtual exhibit by Daisy Ocampo, a professor at Cal State San Bernardino, and several public history students, as well as Maureen Sisquak out at Sherman Indian Museum, who've put together a virtual museum of the images and experiences of people at Sherman that span the time of Sherman Institute. So please, if we can put a link to this in the chat, that would be great, so that way people could organize this. So people could look at this. Sorry, I'm reading the chat and trying to talk at the same time. So you could go through this exhibit. The easiest way to do it is to press the play button and then just kind of let it guide you through the exhibition space. So please take a look at that, so that way you can see the change over time in the ways that Native people have really been impacted, but the ways that they continue to persist at Sherman. At the same time, looking for ways to bring this narrative forward, I highly encourage you to look at these other videos, by a more recent one by James Ramos, looking at the future of San Manuel, exploring the reservation's history, land stewardship, and then this salt song video is also an excellent resource for you all to share with your students, that looks at Native people, especially looking at Colorado, people who lived along the Colorado, and Kuya people, Chemehuevi people, Southern Paiute people, and the ways that they use the salt songs for healing, especially at Sherman. Finally, I have a whole list of resources for you all. When this is shared with you, you'll be able to click on all of these, and they're immediately will take you to a variety of resources. Tending the Wild has tons of videos that are great to use with students at all levels, showing Native people today continuing to be practitioners of the land and caretakers of the land, but again, in the 21st century. So you can see the ways that Native people persist, but still use their understandings. So with that, that's all I have. If any of you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, and then I'll stick around for the breakout sessions.
I do have a question. I've looked and I've tried to find it before. When did it stop being under federal control? Because I know I live right down the street from it, so I know that there's still students that attend that school, but when did it stop being from under the federal control? 1960s or 70s?
So from my understanding is that Sherman still receives its funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I'd have to double check on that. But in the 70s and 80s in particular, the shift of Sherman focused quite heavily to be really an active site that promotes Native cultures and connection to Native ways of life, rather than trying to suppress it or assimilate or acculturate people.
Is it, how many of these schools are still in existence then?
Around, I'm not sure of the number around the United States. I think there are still a handful.
And this one's still a boarding school, I'm assuming. I
Yeah,
never, I'm telling you, I live up the street and I never see any students. I never see any students there, but I'm sure they are. So it's interesting that I wish I knew a little bit more. I want to try and go to the museum, but it's been with COVID, it's been shut down recently.
yeah, there are still students there. Again, with COVID, I'm not sure how that changed, but I think there are still students there. This virtual exhibit is a really great source. If you can't go in person, they have tons and tons of resources here online on this website. And then also you can go to, I included it here. Maybe I'll add it. I don't know if I included it. On Calisphere's website, they have all of the digitized resources of Sherman Indian Museum. So you can view thousands of the items in their collection without having to leave your house, with things that you can include in your lessons. Okay, does anybody else have any questions? When I optimize my screen for the video, I can't see any of your faces anymore. So if you have hands raised, I can't see it.
I don't see anything in the chat, Professor Lormer.
Okay. Okay, well, I can stop sharing if you guys want to take over or share your screens, whatever you want to do, but that's all I have. I'm happy to share anything with you all. If you have any questions, I'll put my email address in the chat. Feel free to email me. I love working with teachers and educators. It's my passion in life now.
Thank you so much. And if you all want to hit those like clap emojis, or just unmute and give Professor Lormer a round of applause for that terrific talk and those great resources. And what we're going to do now is transition into our breakout rooms for the last 20 minutes here. And we are going to, like I said in the chat, walk you through some ideas on how you can incorporate this local history into your classrooms. So in a couple of seconds, you're going to be receiving a prompt to join a big breakout room, and that prompt is based on how you signed in. So if you have a HS by your name that is assigned to us, that you're going to go to the high school group, that'll be with me. If you have ES, you will be in ethnic studies with Cindy. EL will be in elementary with Amparo, and then MS is going to be in the middle school group with Don. Okay. So if you see that prompt, go ahead and join.
Okay, and then for folks, I can help guide you to your rooms. Don